Alright, so I figured it was about time that we decided what was the better creepy dudes in hats that basically control everything in the world movie. So, I'd actually been wanting to do Dark City for a long time. The original plan for a while was to do it with Brazil, which in many ways might seem more fitting, but the more I thought about it, the more I figured that's probably a particular case where it's probably better to do Gilliam with just another Gilliam. Whatever that might be, I don't really know yet, but despite the fact that I've already done 12 Monkeys and Looper, but that's... Brazil's on a bit more of a different scale than 12 Monkeys was, so we'll do that at some point, and for now I figured we'd stick with this. Having said that, obviously, it does seem a bit unfair. It does seem like one movie is a much bigger deal than the other, so I figure just for the sake of fairness, we'll start with the Adjustment Bureau, because it's like, the Adjustment Bureau, you know, stands on its own 2 feet, but it's like, if we were to talk about Dark City first, just the Adjustment Bureau would just seem so bland in comparison, and everything would just be really already beaten down. So we'll start with the Adjustment Bureau. So the interesting thing here is that this is a movie that's basically, I mean, yeah, sure, I guess technically it is a thriller, even though I feel like it's a very soft use of the term and the genre. I mean, I suppose being chased around and the biggest threat being you're going to get lobotomized is pretty thrilling, or whatever you want to say, but yeah, it is weird, though, when you think about it, the fact that the Adjustment Bureau is basically like this really nice romance movie that just kind of happens to have this happening around it. It's like you could edit out Anthony Mackie and John Slattery and Terrence Stamp, and this is just, and not change a thing. And this is like your average cliche romance movie, all the way up to the climax being him having to run and stop a wedding. I mean, it gets that into it, but we're actually pulled into that at the very start with Thomas Newman's score at the very beginning, where it's sort of he somehow found a way to sort of fit both places. How like you can somewhat hear it as like maybe the start of some, you know, small scale thriller or whatever, but it does also kind of sound like it could be the start of a romance movie as well. So, I don't know how he pulled that off, but good for him, as always. So, what our lead character is here is, well, obviously, once again, even the characters feel like they're straight out of a romance movie. We've started off with Matt Damon, who is the handsome dude that's always wearing suits, and he is he was the youngest congressman ever when he started, apparently, and now he's running for Senate. Which he will ultimately lose very quickly because he's got sort of a bad boy lifestyle. And then he actually does have these sort of genuine moments where he actually talks about how much of an artifice his job turns him into, when his whole like campaign started with him being authentic. So he does have the really nice scene where he basically lets the masses know about the behind-the-scenes stuff, like the way people have to choose his tie for him and his shoes and stuff like that. And it really does actually give his character the actual authenticity that they're going for. And it's interesting that his whole character is built around that, even if there is a bit of an interesting irony there about the whole... how he's basically saying that he's controlled by all his people, but he wants to be more authentic, despite the fact that we know he's being controlled by a higher power anyway. But then you might also say maybe those two things are, like, symbolic of each other. Like, the whole fact that he is being controlled by a higher power in the long run, and that, like, the way he's controlled for his job is just a small symptom of that or something. You could say that, I suppose, but then, of course, we do have the scene where he ends up meeting Emily Blunt. Obviously, I also chose the Adjustment Bureau because it's like, I'm sure just all of you are not quite sick yet of hearing me talk about how much I love Emily Blunt. So now we get to do that in this case where, yeah, it is that typical romance thing to where it's like, it's one of those things that where the movie asks us to buy an instant connection that everything in this movie is going to be based around. And we just kind of have to go with it. But I think that actually works within the confines of this movie, because that's, like, the point. The whole point of the movie is that this is a thing that is supposed to happen between them. And there is something there to where it's like, I'm sure it's easy to imagine, seeing Emily Blunt in her wedding crashing dress and falling instantly in love, but then there's also the way she sees him, in pretty much the same manner, and there's just this instant thing here, and it's like, you do get it from his perspective, where it's like, he sees it as like a serendipitous thing pretty much immediately, especially when she runs out of his life, and he thinks maybe forever. Could it be something that sort of propels that even more, regardless of what the whole concept is of them having to be together anyway? Like that's destined to happen anyway. But there's also, you could say, the way that how she's familiar with him from, like, seeing him on TV and stuff like that. And we're not quite sure, like, how long she's been following him, but there seems to be a connection there already, just from the way she's observed him from a distance, and the way that she says, the lifestyle that gets him in trouble is something that she can actually relate to. So there is, like, a foundation there before it's just like it's not like, two strangers just, instantly, like most romance movies are. So there is sort of a foundation there before we really get into that, but then so we go ahead, and it's easier to stick with when it takes off in that direction that it does. And yeah, she is the kind of character to where, like, she could probably seem obnoxious at first, because she's played up as, like, the girl that gets into trouble for seemingly no reason, just for the sake of it, whether it be the wedding crashing thing, or the way she said she relates to what he does. But then there's also the scenes where, like, she just takes his phone and drops it in his coffee to make it stop ringing. And it's like, yeah, in a real-world scenario, you'd be like, wow, that is just one of the most unappealing things somebody could do. That is incredibly reckless and costly, and just for the sake of you being charming. And you could look at it that way also. And then there's the whole thing where it's like, she's basically sort of like, she might come off like the Manic Pixie Dream Girl from Cameron Crowe movies or something, which does kind of could potentially pull apart what they set up pretty well in the bathroom scene to start them off. But the thing about it here is that it's Blunt and the casting of Blunt that I think really sort of makes it rise above that character. Like, of course she's going to find a way to make it seem like there's more to this character than just that, or she at least gives it some kind of dignity to where you don't just immediately dismiss the character as, any other character that would do that is just, like, just kills any interest or investment that you would have in this blossoming romance. So there is that. So, and like I said, just the casting of her alone sort of kind of takes that in the direction. If this was somebody like, let's just keep on the Cameron Crowe thing, let's say a Kate Hudson or a Kirsten Dunst or something, it might not be as, it might not have felt as above that as it does with her here, but yeah, so that was more so, not only is she, of course, amazing in it, but it was just kind of a stroke of genius in casting, too, to make sure that absolutely sold, so I think that had a lot to do with that. And yeah, and there is just the power of this whole thing in general, the attraction between them, is established by this whole concept of this was absolutely supposed to happen, and that's also really highlighted by the chemistry that her and Damon have, because if that wasn't there, this whole movie was just going to crumble from the very start. If you got two people that just really did not seem to have that connection at all. Because there's even those moments where, like, the movie almost wants to call it out, like when it's decided that the whole thing is going to change if they kiss at lunch, and that'll just change the whole thing, and then Slattery says, like, so wait, just whether they kiss or not, like, that's it, that's what's going to decide this whole thing. But yeah, once we really, once again get into the concept, it does actually make sense within the confines of the story, believe it or not. So going into that, there's also the side characters I've been talking about: Anthony Mackie, John Slattery, Terrence Stamp. The thing here is that I think this is sort of, it's is it weird to say that this might work better as a romance movie than it does in the thriller portions? Because it's not that any of those actors do anything wrong here. It is sort of like, I mean, there is something sort of otherworldly about them already. Just like there's something like off about them, like the way they say their lines to each other. It's just, you can just tell that something is not right and they don't quite belong within the world, within like other people. There's something definitely different about them. And we you know, highlight that with the scenes when they are fixing things, and we have that eerie scene where Damon walks through his office, and it's just so casual that he doesn't realize that everybody's like frozen in place, and that sort of adds like an eerie quality to that kind of stuff. But then we have like the Bruce Almighty scene where Slattery explains to him exactly what's going on, and there is some interesting stuff here, talking about like how, and the movie kind of opens up some interesting ideas, which, to my understanding, was the director's pretty much whole point in making this, was to examine these kind of things, like how, like, every mundane thing that holds you back but seems like any everyday thing, like losing the internet for a second or losing your keys or something, is something being fixed in the timeline or in the path to send you in the direction that you're supposed to go in, where maybe you might have gotten off it and were going a different direction, but you've somehow been fixed in this little time period that otherwise seems normal to you. And they do have, like, throwing in those things to where it's like those mundane activities are actually intentional delays is an interesting concept, and is kind of what the whole basis for, you know, the concept is. But then there's also the stuff like the scenes where they walk around in public. When I was talking about how something seems off about them, that's fine, and that establishes the characters. But when the scenes where it's like they're supposedly like blending in, like when they're around, they can just walk around in public. I guess the whole idea is that you just see them as another person. It's like these things are happening, you don't even realize they're there because you don't even recognize them because they look so normal. I don't know. I think they stand out quite a bit. Maybe that's because I know. I don't know, but I don't think that's handled as well as it could be, and it doesn't quite get across the point the writer-director clearly wants to make here. But yeah, I'd still say that could have been worked on a little bit, and there's something a bit surreal about that, but that, you know, surreal quality doesn't really come through in the execution. So I do think that's a bit of a downer, and that's something that really sort of, you know, where the thriller aspect of the movie sort of stumbles. But then every now and then there's also just those weird, like I said, those eerie moments, like him walking through the office. More stuff like that, like this, I guess this technically qualifies. It would also be the scene after they have slept together for the first time, and then when they do their, you know, romantic, you know, cuddle sleep thing, we get this like pan back and we see that Terrence Stamp is at the end of the bed watching them. Stuff like that does sort of establish that sort of uneasy quality that probably should be more prominent here, especially when it comes to those guys. But I don't know, it just seems like the movie really didn't quite hit that in the way it probably looked like it could have on paper. On paper, this probably looked and sounded really good, but to actually see it probably does not quite have that same effect. But there is still some cool things in here, like the way they can like transport through the doors and stuff like that, and how they can go like from the baseball field to, like, you know, up subway steps, and then the way the scenes change and all that. Statue of Liberty doing all that stuff, and then the way they can sort of just make everything back to normal immediately. I do think it does seem a little sloppy when you say, like, hey, Matt Damon, you found out our secret, now we're going to lobotomize you if you don't shut up. But then, like, so many people there's something very bumbling about the way they do things, considering that this all starts with Anthony Mackie almost nodding off. That's, like, the whole set-off to the whole movie. It's Anthony Mackie almost fell asleep. And maybe that's saying something about the fact that it could just be the simplest thing that sends somebody on a totally different path. Gwyneth Paltrow made a whole movie about this called Sliding Doors that you can check out that I actually really like. It actually is a better execution of this sort of idea, but Yeah, even so. And on top of that, we do have, you know, some interesting supporting characters here and there, most notably Michael Kelly playing Damon's friend that also works with him. He's basically playing, like, this was a couple of years, I think, before House of Cards, but he's basically playing, like, the upbeat Doug Stamper before he got all dark and shit and went in all those directions. So it is nice to see that, especially pre-House of Cards. So when it's like, it's almost like this character is a prequel to that character. But yeah, and then there's this whole thing to where it's like, it feels like there should be something more to her character than there is. And the way they set it up almost feels like they could have done something effective with this, because there's something mysterious about these circumstances. Not just the fact that they're meant to be together, but the stuff that they throw in, like, well, kind of like how she just happens to be in the right place at the right time, and even that, like, throws them off. Like, somehow that's unexpected to them. Or then there's the case when he says, when they got separated again, and he says he looked her up online, and there were, I mean, obviously he only had a first name, so obviously it was very doubtful he was going to find her. But apparently he looked so thoroughly that he said there were 757,000 Elises, and none of them were her. And it's like, it's almost like for him to know this, it's like, did he go through, I mean, 3 years passed. Did he look through all of them? It would be bizarre if there was, like, no record of her whatsoever. But no, that's just, she was just hard to find. She's actually very normal. But it's like, it's almost like you expect some sort of twist where it's like she was part of the plan all along or something, but it was like a totally different plan that did not involve, like, ending up with her or falling for her or anything like that. But no, they keep it pretty basic on that front, so that stuff that seemed like it was kind of interesting is just in there now and doesn't really matter. It doesn't really mean anything either, just she's hard to find when she disappears. So there's that. And another thing like that also is you sort of expect their limitations to be a bit more prominent than they are. Like when Anthony Mackie goes through the whole process of telling us, like, you know, water, you know, blocks us. We can't really see what's going on when water's around, and that's really only building up to the rain thing. You think it's going to be a bit more crucial, but not really. Then there's the whole thing about how they need the hats to transport, which does make sense for him to go from place to place like he does at the end, but even so, I mean, it does lead to some funny things here and there, like the way he says that because everything is, like, mapped out and that's their job. The scene where, like, Mackie has an epiphany and he's like, yeah, that's good, improvisation. We're not very good with that. But overall, it does seem like it was building up for things to have bigger payoffs than they have, like, throughout, that don't really go anywhere, or just kind of like, oh yeah, that does serve, you know, the climax, I suppose, but, you know, the way we established it so early, I kind of thought that was going to be a bigger deal, so it could probably seem a bit underwhelming when we get to that point. And the movie almost just kind of, like, stops and decides, well, okay, you've done this long enough, go ahead. You were supposed to be together anyway. This was all for nothing, I guess. We just had to ask the chairman if it was okay. That's all we needed to do this whole time. So yeah, I guess they had to prove their love, I suppose, but a whole lot to just get to that, so there is that. Speaking of the chairman, it appears that, well, first off, not only was this based on the Phil K. Dick story, Adjustment Team. To the movie's credit, Adjustment Bureau sounds a lot better. But there was also, I'm not quite sure exactly how accurate that is. I think it was just more of a basis than anything else. But to talk about alternate versions, there was also, I guess there was another ending planned where the chairman was actually going to be revealed, like, in a form. And it was going to be Sheree Agdashlu playing her, the Oscar-nominated actress from The House of Sand and Vogue, among many other things. I think she's on that one show now, but I'm sure you know who she is. But she was going to play the chairman, and I guess this was, like, a really big deal because apparently the whole idea surrounding it, to most people, the director just throws out one of those lazy things like, I just wanted to raise questions. That's what I meant when I wrote this. And that's really all he says. But the large assumption seems to be that the chairman is God, and the dudes in hats, Mackie, Stamp, and Slattery, are all angels putting this together. I mean, it's pretty, you know, I guess an obvious thing or whatever, but even so, I guess there was going to be a whole thing where the chairman was shown, and it was like, this is an actress's chance to play God. And I guess Magda Ashley thought this was a really big deal for her, and then obviously it ended up not happening at all. Like, they didn't even shoot it. And there's this weird scenario where the director said that apparently he wanted to leave it up to, like, the audience's beliefs or something, like have them have their own beliefs or something. I don't know if that means, like, basically it would be his way of confirming that this story has a god in it, I guess. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to kind of leave it up to the whole, maybe there's a chairman, but because we don't see it, we can just think anything about the chairman that we pretty much want to. I guess, but then I guess Agda Ashley had another story where he went to her, like, almost crying and said that they couldn't do it because Universal didn't want her. So it's hard to tell which of these is the actual thing, or if there's a truth, like, in the middle here somewhere with sort of parts of both of these. I don't know. Or maybe the mixed up details make him sound like... Because when I read that, my first thought is, like, he seems a little shady. Like, it feels like there's something missing here. It's like, one of these things can't be true. Like, they both can't be true, I mean. So, I don't know. But regardless, that's how we basically got to the very fast ending that we get to, where it's like, just go, be on your way, because the chairman changed their mind. So that's what we have. So yeah, to finish it, that's basically everything I said before. It feels like there should be much more of, like, a surreal quality. Like, it's like it's too downplayed considering what it is. I don't know, maybe that grounds the romance better, but then the thing is that does make the romance look better, but it still is not helping in the other side of the movie that's sort of making all this happen. So, yeah, I can see, like, I don't know, I could see the downplayedness, adding to it, like I said, particularly on paper, but, like I said, the execution just doesn't really pull it off, but... I mean, overall, it's a movie that I like, for the most part, even if I do feel like it's rushed in certain cases, and it doesn't quite explore it as much as it probably could, and I do think he copped out a bit by saying, I just want to raise questions, it's your own beliefs, or whatever. So, yeah, that doesn't, like, we'll see that Proyas made that idea work, much more in regards to own interpretations and stuff like that. So, why don't we get right to that? The thing about it is, Alex Proyas is a director that I have praised many times before. You might know him from, obviously, his real big thing besides this is he did The Crow, of course. But then he has since gone on to, like, more bigger spectacle things like I, Robot and Knowing with Nicolas Cage and stuff like that. He also did Gods of Egypt, which everybody hates. It's kind of a guilty pleasure to me, but most people hate it. But and it kind of sent him off in a, that's why we haven't heard from him in a long time kind of thing, I think. So yeah, I believe he was also going to do Paradise Lost for a while there before that fell through. So that would have been, I feel like that would have been really, I've always kind of wanted to see that, but I guess we'll never know. So, and he co-wrote it with Lem Dobbs, who is a frequent collaborator of Steven Soderbergh, and David S. Goyer, who I'm sure is a name you all know at this point, for the good and the bad that he's done, because he has many of both. So, the thing about this is, first off, you'll notice this is the really awesome director's cut, which changed a few things. Most notably, this one makes a lot more sense than the other one does, that's for sure. But to start off with, it very much, obviously, like I said, there's going to be Blade Runner comparisons, but there's one very big Blade Runner comparison you can make, and that is the fact that both these movies decided that they were going to omit the original opening, which had narration that pretty much said too much. And while Blade Runner got rid of its opening narration because Ridley Scott wanted people to... basically, he felt like it spelled it out. He wanted people to interpret things themselves. He didn't want it to say anything, really. The thing about the opening narration in Dark City, which was taken out of this cut for the better, is that it was sort of setting things up, like, right before they happened. It was saying a little too much about what was about to happen, and it really kind of changed the impact when we actually just see it play out in the movie. So it works much better. It's just this silent panning down shot to Kiefer Sutherland, realizing that midnight's coming, and that's a much better opening. And then we get to see all the stuff that we would have already known about prior, once it happens, and it definitely hits in a much bigger way. It seems like something small, but it makes definitely a big difference, especially when you're introducing like the major characters in the movie. So, in talking also about that opening shot, it is another one of those cases where it's like the setting of this movie is just like so fun to analyze throughout the movie. It's one of those cases where it sort of sucks when you know a little, like it's one of those cases where it's really fun to think about what the hell is going on the first time you see it. Then once you've seen it again and you pretty much know what exactly is going on here, I mean, obviously it's definitely a movie that you can just watch again and again and probably notice a bunch of shit you hadn't before, because there's just so much imagination in it and so much detail and something that might mean something very crucial that we only see for like a second. It's one of those. But there's also stuff like when you see the opening shot and it starts in what looks like a night sky, which could ultimately be space itself, like we're in it. And then it pans down and there's just like this stuff, and then we're in the city and we pan down to Kiefer Sutherland, and it's like you don't really realize if the first time you see it just how literally to take that shot, because it's like, oh, look, it's space, and then it's like, oh, that was a nice transition to Earth, is what you're thinking. So it is really nice. So obviously you are aware that stuff's going to be given away in this by now, right? I've done this long enough. So and then you basically after a while just start to have the impression like, what if this is just like basically the city is just like one giant lab rat cage, and then everything is just, with the tuning and everything just being, what we learn very quickly is just like this giant test on humans, with them basically trying to understand the human soul and all that. But the thing about it is that, but there's also that thing where like, you do start to wonder, but what was before and all that, because we do have the scene when Kiefer Sutherland says like, we can take the city back, which seems to somewhat contrast with his reveals later, but yeah, there's dialogue that can mean a number of things in this movie. You just have to really analyze it, which we will, not to seem like I'm just skipping over that, but obviously to talk about everything in this movie, we'd need a while, but to start off with, I do want to mention that sort of the atmosphere is what always sort of draws me to this movie. Like, that's the thing that I always leave it thinking about. While the movie does have, like, the big ideas and all the really interesting stuff it gets into, just, like, everything from the way it's shot to, like, the production design, and it's just this whole atmosphere that it has is, like, crazy and definitely its own thing. Like I said, you could say it's, you know, everything from Blade Runner to Fritz Lang's Metropolis are probably hanging out in here, but it still feels very much like its own unique thing. And it's always something that whenever I think about it, I just really, really just crave revisiting it. And it also has that whole feel of like, it's like a noir mystery setup, of course, like many movies do. But once again, this is one of the movies that just does it really right, because, like I said, noir is one of those things that is tried often, but it's a really distinct thing that you have to hit just right. And a lot of movies, like, you can sense that that's where they want to be, but you can also tell they're not quite getting there. But this definitely really hits that mark, where it's got stuff like Jennifer Connelly on the stage. It's like the old scenes in like the clubs and those, you know, black and white gangster movies or whatever, or mysteries, where they always seem to end up in those smoky clubs where there's always the beautiful woman getting her own, you know, musical scene, regardless of what genre the movie is. There's always like the one full song number that the actress gets. Connelly gets a couple of those scenes actually, but then there's also like, you look at, I was talking about the production design, and something that the movie does that's so interesting that I love, that I actually, much as I love how unique it is to Dark City, it's something I'd actually kind of like to see more, and that is like this meshing of periods, where it's like, this could be like, you know, present day 1998 when it came out, or it could also be like the 1940s. Like, you see, like the exteriors where we're, like, in the city, and it's almost like, it's like Tim Burton's Gotham, is what it's like, and then there's, like, just smoke coming out of random places in the ground. Some of the cars look older, and some of them are sort of shrouded in the darkness. But then we go inside places. We get these interior shots, and yeah, it feels like we're like in the 1940s. The costumes kind of go into that too, but there's also, once again, sometimes they find that middle ground. Like, there's a lot of the sort of noiry, like, long coats everybody's wearing. But then there's, yeah, but then there's also the way they shoot these things. Like, there is the everything sort of, for a while there, especially at the beginning, there's a lot more of the camera being in one place shots, and we get these shots that sort of do that illusion thing where, like, just a normal sized hallway can look like it's practically endless because of the certain angle that we're at. It makes everything look huge because we're down here. Also at the automat, they kind of do the same thing, but with, like, where the tables are, it's almost sort of like it's akin to the city shots where we're down on the ground and the buildings go, like, all the way up, and it's like, because these are, like, lower shots, it makes everything feel like it's taller around it. Like that. There's recurring visuals throughout like that, particularly the whole spiral thing that keeps recurring throughout it. Like, obviously we get those spiral things when we see the title of the movie, but then there's also obviously fingerprints play a big deal. There's a lot of lingering shots on those. There's the markings on the dead girl and stuff like that. There's the maze that Kiefer Sutherland has in his place that he refers to. And yeah, and it's still just really, like I said, it just creates this whole world that is, like, all its own, but still somehow feels like it's like this 1940s mystery. You even have, like, William Hurt walking in, who's, like, this detective, and he's got the hat and the coat, and he has his one-liners, like the prostitute that's dead and, like, had the spirals carved into her, and she's laying on the side of the bed, and he just walks in, the first thing he says is, "Looks like somebody woke up on the wrong side of the bed." And it's like, it just really somehow immediately throws itself into that, while also feeling, like, totally futuristic at the same time, especially when we go down to where the strangers are, and it's the whole, like, there's definitely a contrast there between what the city looks like and those sort of meshing periods, but then it's also, like, then we see, like, this futuristic, like, otherworldly underworld, and it's like, I was talking about Fritz Lang's Metropolis. It's like Metropolis meets Hellraiser is what this looks like. And it's like, it's one of those things where, like, you can, I love the way it's illustrated on this cover here, especially with all of them, like, circling it like they are, and it's like, it's one of those things where you could try to explain it, but one would just have to see it. It's like, it's really, like, I'm trying to figure out how they even went about, like, creating this from the ground up, this whole thing. And they do that where it's like, it's my understanding all of them are, like, when they're in this underworld, but they're, like, I think they're based on, like, the Roman Council or something, and then there's the whole thing where it's, like, the thing I wanted to get to was the way they seem to contrast, really, this world and that world. It's sort of like the whole time machine scenario with the Morlocks and the Eloys and stuff like that. But then there is the tuning scene, which is, like, the big centerpiece of the movie, where we really get to see what is always happening at this time that's causing all this to happen. So we have this scenario where it has a great starting point. Like, this could be its own scene, and that would be, like, a wow scene in any other movie, but this is just the starting point of the tuning scene. And that is when everything stops. Like, it is weird because for a lot of the movie, the city streets seem, like, empty. And it's really just, like, Rufus Sewell just sort of walking around by himself, occasionally following Kiefer Sutherland or somebody else, or being stalked by Richard O'Brien and the other guys, the other strangers. So this moment, though, where we see the city, like, running in full force, we see the trains going, we see backed up traffic, and everything just immediately, simultaneously stops, and everybody that's, like, standing just drops, or if they're at a table, they just keel over. But then the way this continues, and they rise up, and the buildings can actually, like, shift, and they just change everything. And then the way, my personal favorite segment, when you have like the poor couple talking about like his shitty job and all that, and they're sitting at this really ratty looking dinner table, and then they like they make the table, they spread the table out, they make it longer in this nice effect, and then they turn into like this aristocratic couple that's in like this huge castle like mansion, starting in this tiny shit ass apartment with this tiny table, and even when they wake up, they're talking like they're like aristocrats, and after they were just this really sort of rundown couple, and that's just stuff like that is so brilliant to throw into this whole thing. Just there's little things too that they kind of devote time to show specifically the difference it makes when they do this change, not just like a whole overall thing. Just those little things they focus on in between too to really show it off like that is just perfect. And it really sort of brings these worlds together in an interesting way that you wouldn't expect. And it's something that you kind of buy for the rest of the movie. There's not some sort of weird contrast when we're cutting back and forth. It all feels like it's sort of one thing now, which we learn might be closer to the truth than we realize. So, as that goes on also, there is the whole thing of, I was talking about the atmosphere of it, but also just the nightmarish feel of it. Like I said, one of my favorite types of movies is the ones that make you feel like you're just living a nightmare. Like to my understanding, one of Proyas's big inspirations was when Orson Welles did The Trial with Anthony Perkins. How that movie just sort of, like the whole point of that, and even Kafka's whole point of writing it, was the whole, you actually feel like you're inside someone's nightmare, and Rufus Sewell actually has the line, I feel like I'm in someone else's nightmare. And that's true. You do have like these really, I mean, the strangers themselves just look really, they're absolutely definitely nightmare fuel. There's actually when this came out February of 1998, so I would have been 7 at the time, and the TV spots scared the holy shit out of me. Just the TV spots. But I was still like really curious to know what it was about anyway. I ended up not, I was so scared of it, I ended up not seeing it until I was like in my mid-teens, but still up to that point, this movie was always kind of a mystery to me. It's like, what is that exactly? Because it just looked like a horror movie. I think that was how it was like intentionally marketed, to get more of like a teen crowd and not more of like a sort of, sci-fi crowd. This was the year before The Matrix, before that was really like the huge deal that The Matrix ended up making it, but still, there is that stuff like where they feel like, not just them with like their long coats and the hats and all that and their white faces, which is great. When we a few years ago we ended up at the Planet Hollywood that's in like the Myrtle Beach area, and there was a lot of great memorabilia there in the glass cases, but one of my absolute favorite things that I got to see in person was one of the, I think it might have been Richard O'Brien's costume. It was one of them, him and Bruce Spence and them. Bruce Spence we know from The Road Warrior and Beyond Thunderdome and all that. And that's, those characters like always struck me as something. Even like the kid, the way it's like, he's obviously like an older stranger, but he's in the kid's body. It's like the kid in Near Dark, basically. But which sort of makes him like the most evil and the most creepy for sure. But then, like I said, we go underground, and we've got Ian Richardson and all of them, and it's like going back to the Hellraiser thing, they're basically dressed like Cenobites from Hellraiser, and it's really damn creepy. It's like if, in Coneheads, when we go to Remuac, it's like if all of them were the Cenobites from Hellraiser, is basically what it's like down here. Like I said, kind of a very hard thing to explain, which is the beauty of the movie, so, yeah, and there is always, and the way they build them up, like, these really just endlessly nightmarish creatures, like, not just when we see them and the things they do and what they're capable of, and even when they're, like, dying, when the one gets, like, his head sliced in half, there's still just something so unsettling. But then we get stuff that sort of shows clues to that, like, when the kid shows them, like, the crown drawing of them after the murder, and it's like they really find a way to unsettle you. But then there's also, like, because there's like a certain coldness to this movie, it does sort of seem like it kind of sort of tries to get there, to get to another side of that, which is pretty much personified in the entire movie by the whole Shell Beach thing. Because the thing here is that it's even though they're like the antagonists, it still seems like the movie's setting them up in a bit of a sympathetic way when Kiefer Sutherland tells us, their planet was dying and they're just, trying to survive. They're a dying breed, and that's why they're basically using us to try to figure out, like what the secret to our soul is, basically, and to basically attempt to save themselves. And it sort of makes them sympathetic for a little while, despite the fact that we still have a big old, action ending, but even so, that ends in an impaling and all that stuff. But even despite that kind of stuff, it does seem like they want to find something that kind of, takes us away from that coldness at least a little bit, so we're not constantly wallowing in it. Because obviously we're living in a sunless world. It's going to be pretty dark and bleak for a long time. So there's some stuff like that kind of makes them sympathetic. Also, I don't think it's ever actually explicitly said, but I think Alex Proyas has said once that when he wrote it, he was under the impression that the strangers basically sort of created Shell Beach as like a false memory, but like in a sense to like basically give them hope, like make them feel like there is something, like the way we see. When he mentions it to the cab driver, and the cab driver is like, "Oh yeah, I know that place," and it's like he doesn't quite know that place, but he's pretty sure he knows that place, but he can't place like a specific memory to it, and basically to basically give them that bit of light in this dark world. It's like there is something there that makes them seem like they're not totally cruel. You could probably take that in a cruel direction because it's like a hopeful thing that they'll never see, but still, I like to think that it's something that they did for a more, it was like the most human thing they did. They had that in them. And then there's the stuff like, they basically battle the coldness with more coldness, but it still shows you that, like, it's acknowledging that there's, like, these are real people, even if they're in this, seemingly unreal world. Like, the moment when the prostitute played by Melissa George is found dead, and obviously she's been carved up and all that. And then we learn at the crime scene that she has a daughter. And then there's like a whole thing there to where it's like, okay, so the deaths in this dark and cruel world do have a consequence to innocent people. And it's like there is something there that the movie hadn't really shown us before. That kind of shows it that it does have... There is a heart in there. It may be like cold and black, but it's in there. Because the movie has to be cold and black. But they do have those little moments where it's like the movie's not entirely trying to block off, the thought of humanity. The whole point is to find the humanity, but it has to be in a very dark and bleak way. So there is that. And then of course there's great uses of practical effects. I was kind of amazed when I learned that the scene where he gets crushed in between the two buildings as the buildings move, that there weren't many like CGI effects here. Like these were actually like two sets. The buildings that were actually being pushed together is kind of amazing and just really, makes it this big spectacle of a thing when stuff like that actually happens in the movie. It doesn't feel like it's just some, CGI fest or whatever. That may be why I'm not huge on the climax, especially with the way that, while there were action scenes throughout the movie, they're mostly like, small fights or chases or whatever, and they still feel like there's something horrific about them because of the nightmarish way they play out. Like when we see Richard O'Brien fall to his death at the very beginning, and then he rises from the other side, shit like that. But it does just feel like one big, climax and all that. That's very sort of, CGI and effects that looked really good in 1998, I imagine, but obviously there's like the whole effect of, the power coming out of his forehead and stuff like that. It looks a little rough these days, but yeah, this is a movie that probably would have been fine with a smaller climax, but at the same time you want to commend them for just going all out. So, which this movie does in like all aspects. So yeah, it's really kind of hard to fight it. So, and as I was saying, there are some really great performances here too. Like Rufus Sewell has to be the main character here, and really you would think like immediately he's stuck in this very bizarre-ass world, not knowing what's going on with his memory taken. He wakes up in a bathtub and his injection's gone wrong and he's still bleeding from it. And you would think his character would just kind of have that constantly frantic thing. him throwing people against walls, saying like, you know, who am I and stuff like that. But he's very downplayed. He also has like this sort of constant fear and like uncertainty in the way he goes from place to place. There's a really great scene where he like interrogates himself, like his reflection, trying to figure out what his first name is because he only knows his first initial. So he's a really great lead. It makes me wonder like how he doesn't have more like, you know, obviously in TV, sure, but I mean in movies, he can really handle lead roles, and he really should have more of those. That's kind of a shame, but then, as I said, we also have Kiefer Sutherland, who's doing like, he seems to be having a lot of fun doing like the old-fashioned creepy scientist sort of guy, like Peter Lorre on Speed when he like really gets into it. But what's really interesting about that is, and he's also got like the fucked up eye and the hobble and all that. But what's interesting about that is like when he's really in his element, like when he's doing like the sciencey stuff, he's like, you know, like I said, like a mad scientist type, or like when they're doing the tuning scene and he's doing the injections, he's way too into it, and he's like, that scene where he like goes into the room and he's like accounting for the kids, and it's like, this is a dude that's like really into this. But then when he's, you know, with the strangers, we realize that he's just like this sort of pawn of theirs, and he's like this really small, terrified dude that just like buckles so easily, and he plays both those parts of it like really well. So he's always been one of the more interesting characters in it. And then of course there's Jennifer Connelly and William Hurt and all that who are great. And the thing about it though is Ebert actually made a really interesting observation about the performances in this movie, and that's the fact that like for Connelly's case or Hurt's case, and that was that usually you think about like the background of your character and all that, and you could say like, well, they came from this, so I'll play it like this, or maybe they're remembering this, so I'll play it like this. But the interesting thing is you're playing characters that don't remember jack shit. They don't because they don't come from those places. Those places are like injected in. You could say maybe they're using what this person might have had injected into them to play this part this way, or this line this certain way, or whatever. But yeah, even so, these are characters whose lives are like based on just ever-changing things. And so that's always interesting, the way the actors had to kind of approach that, and they didn't really have that sort of safety net to fall back on or anything to like reference. They just kind of have to play a character that's just living like in the moment, even though they don't realize it, which had to have been like really interesting. It almost sounds like an acting exercise in like acting school or something, and it's really, so that had to have been really interesting. So yeah. Now, obviously, being sci-fi and being as high concept as it is, when you have, you know, high concept sci-fi like this, it's basically, you have your people that basically are hell-bent on just poking holes in it. And that could be, but the thing about it, though, is that whether you can do that, it does seem more like, the more that's unexplained. I was talking about what I didn't like about what the director said about the adjustment period, where he's like, I made it just to raise questions. But the thing is with Dark City, it does feel like the more that's unexplained, or the more that's very vaguely explained, not fully explained, just really kind of adds the mystery to it that the whole thing was based on anyway, because the whole thing starts off as a mystery anyway. In these things where we're still not quite sure how this works, or why this would work this way, or what exactly, but it not only adds a mystery to it, but it makes it creepier too. Like, there's something more eerie about the unknown, and this movie actually explores that in a really skillful way without sort of going into the, oh, we just didn't want to explain that, or we just wanted to do weird shit, or whatever. It really does serve just the atmosphere of the movie in general, when there are some things that you can't quite figure out, or some things you don't quite know. So, yeah. So, and like I said, you can look at movies like Metropolis, Blade Runner, and all that, but like and compare it to other movies, but it still feels like absolutely its own unique thing, that stands on its own, where like possibilities are endless, and you're constantly wondering like what's real and what isn't, like what's a real memory, what's a false memory, all that stuff. And it's just endlessly rewatchable, and just like I said, not just for, you know, trying to figure out answers to questions, or trying to figure out, you know, anything really, but just revisiting that atmosphere is what always really gets me in the mood to watch this. So yeah. So, as I said at the beginning, I don't think I really need to state which one I prefer, but obviously, Dark City's been a favorite for a little while, and yeah, the Adjustment Bureau is definitely fine for what it is for a movie that just sort of came and went. Um, yeah, and I don't really hear mentioned like much at all anymore. So there is that. So yes, that's what we have here. So don't know what the next one is at all, but I'll get that figured out at some point. We're gonna have a lot in regards to reviews. I think the next video is gonna be Black Klansman, Happy Time Murders, Bad Samaritan, and probably a couple of other things too. So yeah, so until all that stuff, I think that's it.